All right, so let's try and work through the rest of this chapter, or at least most of it. We may not cover the last tiny section on the editing bit. It's not really that critical. But I think this is where we were at the end of the last class. People remembers that a little hard to read up there, isn't it? But this adding action and store method for moving. So what we had done up till then was we were setting stuff up. We were able to fire off our drag and drop events, right? We knew that they were triggering. We were getting a source ID and a target ID, what we're hovering over, but we're not actually taking the action. So the next step is being able to take the action. They talk about some of the complexity that's involved in this drag and drop behavior, because there's not just one thing that we're trying to do, right? If you're dragging within the same list, what you want to do is, as you move it around, you want to reorder your items so that it shows up in the new position. But if you drag it over to another lane, then you need to remove it from the lane you were in, add it to the other lane, and put it in the right position there. And so that's basically what you're setting up here with the actions. So the first one is just being able to move. And that's just moving within your lane, more or less. And it's relatively straightforward. We just import our lane actions and then hook up that lane actions.move that we just defined. The only thing that may be a little bit of a question here is why at the app level, when we hooked up this stuff like lane actions or anything like that, we also connected down here. Whereas I believe on our note, or is it, hold on. Down the lane. Where are we putting this? Oh, we're putting it on notes, all right. Whereas here, we're not exactly hooking it up that way, right? And that's just because that connect was sort of this top level hooking of stuff up. You don't need to necessarily hook up each individual layer. It's that sort of connected information can be passed down. So once we were saying, all right, when we move, we want to take the lane actions move, but we have to define what that actually is. And really all we did here was just move what we had as our little console log from our being inlined on our component up above to moving it down into this lane actions store. So we haven't changed what's happening. All we did was move where that event is happening so that we're following more of our structural pipeline for this action. And the next bit is actually implementing this sort of note drag and drop logic. And we get this really ugly function. So now we take the move and we turn it into this really ugly functional version of move, right? Which is over here in our lane store. And again, this is just some of my preferences. I really don't like the way that this thing is. Is that easy enough for you guys to read? Hard to read? I know it's very dim. I really don't like this preference for let's talk about how we've got a couple different cases that we need to cover. And then let's just slam it all together into this one big function. Because at first you're thinking, what do you mean this function isn't that big? Maybe if you haven't written a lot of code before. But as there's some people who will argue like functions shouldn't be more than 10, 15 lines of code ever, because you just start getting to a point where it's hard to understand all the logic in the function, right? And this one is explicitly, it even mentions it doing two very different things, right? Like here's one thing that it's doing. And here's an entirely different thing that it's doing. And what are the two different cases for? Do you remember? Not sure. The two different cases are for moving it within the lane. So that's why we have if the source lane is the same one as the target lane versus changing the lanes, right? And so you could very easily, with just a little bit of work, I'm not going to go and rewrite this entirely, but I would encourage you when you're writing your own code, try not to, when you first do it, maybe you write it all together like this, but since these are two almost independent bits of logic, you could very easily think of it as if like source lane equals target lane and take all this logic inside of here and put it in something like move note within lane and make a function that takes the stuff that it needs to do that. And then here you could have like a move note to different lane or something like that, or move note between lanes, right? And the interesting bit about that is I just asked you, what are the two different cases that we're trying to cover, right? And we all had a hard time coming up with the answer. What are the two things that this is doing? Whereas if this was rewritten instead, and that's what we had here. So imagine if all of this was it's going to need to take some parameters and stuff. But if that's what we had, and then in our else here, it was actually what the two cases were in that case that we're trying to cover. What we've done by giving it sort of meaningful function names and moving that stuff out is it's very easy for you to look at what the two cases are, right? Whereas what we actually have here from what was written, it's not particularly easy for us to figure out what our cases are because it's just all this logic inline. Even though even in the chapter before this, it's talking about, oh, here's the two different cases we need to deal with. Moving within a lane, moving between lanes. So once again, this is one of those very, very dense functions. So we'll walk through it real fast to help people parse it. But nothing in here except for this update bit, which we'll just close for now and act like it's not there. Nothing else in here is particularly new or special or something that should be too tricky for you given the work that you've done, right? It's just getting used to learning how to read this. So the first thing it does, all right, we get all of our lanes, and then we find out what our source lane is. And the way it's doing that is it's just going over every single lane and finding one that includes the source ID, so the ID of the note that you're trying to drag. So that's what that filter does. It just returns, it's a method on an array that returns the item that matches the filter, or any items that match that filter. But in this case, there should only be one because only one lane should have that note ID in it. And then we do this exact same thing with target lane and target ID. So we're just trying to find what's our lane that we're trying to target, right? So it's the same logic. So again here, another good example, and there's not a need to do it when you're only doing it twice like this, but this is the type of thing where you very well might create a function externally if you're going to do this more often, and just have a function instead that's like find lane for notes or something like that. And it's going to take your lanes and it's going to take your note ID and it's going to return you the lane your notes in or something. That way these could be reduced to just be like find lane for note, give me my lanes and my note ID. And internally it would be this exact same bit of logic. So then here all we're doing is getting the actual index position in the array for our source note and our target note. And then if you're in the exact same lane, so that means you'll be in the same array already. You don't need to change lanes. Then the logic is just changing what your array position is, right? So the way that you do that, and it's not particularly easy when you're trying to move something in an array like this. if you wrote this out in a different way, it's not always easy. So he used this immutable update to assist a little bit. But the idea is like if you had this array and you've got like 6, 2, 5, a horrible 5, 7, 3, 1, and you decide that, okay, I want to move, or I'm moving 5 to the front. There's a few different ways to do this, but all of them require a little bit of work, because what you want to do is you want to take your existing array, like you can do this a few different steps, right? You can take this whole thing and you can say, okay, I want to move this to position 1. So let's take 5 out of the array, which means I sort of go to an array that's like 6, 2, 7, 3, 1. And now I want to put it on in position 0 where I want it to go. So then it would be 5, 6, dot, dot, dot. And that's not too hard. It's particularly easier when you're doing it before your current position, but it's a little trickier. Like I said, 5, I want to put it after 7 or something, because once I've taken 5 out, well, now the index position of these have changed. So I can't just use the index position. I have to maybe use like, I want to put it after this thing. So now let me find the item with that ID and put it after it or something like that. And so it's sort of a multi-step process. And actually a good exercise to try and write out or something. Try and write a small function that changes the position of an item in an array. But that's where this update and some immutability helpers are being used, and some splicing. So there's some sort of shortcuts taking place here. This immutability helper is just a nice little tool that says we're giving you back a new array, so don't worry about what you're doing with like your array. We're not going to reuse your array, and that's because that would cause problems with React if you're changing the state of something without it being through the React ecosystem. It won't know about that state change, and it can cause consistency problems. So all it's doing here is just saying, okay, I know what my note index is, so I want my new array to be from my note index, get one item. So essentially this is that 2-step bit, pull it out. That's what this line is doing. And then it's saying now, go to my target note index of my original array thing here. And I don't know what this 0 is off the top of my head for this splice bit, and then add in this source ID at that point. So that's that injecting it back in. So it's just a little tool that lets you work with the same array for both points. So instead of, the nice aspect of it is instead of having to worry about the index changing, you get to treat both of those as if it's this original version of the array. And the splice tool sort of helps you out and solves the problem about where it will be positioned. So that's really what's going on there. And then we've got the second case, which is moving it to a new lane, and that's a little easier. Because we just need to, for our source lane, slice it out of the array. You're gone. And for our new lane, add it to the array. So we just do some nice simple tools. All right, get it out of the array, put it in the new array, and we're good to go. And then we're going to set state for our lanes, and that's how we lock stuff in, right? So any questions still around that? Because that's, like I said, there's a little bit of magic in there, but no. Okay, go back up. No, you guys good with that? All right. So at that point, we've sort of got like the logic in place, right? We're able to move stuff around. As you drag your node around, it moves around, but then Stroll's like, oh yeah, but let's have some nicer features. Let's give some indication, because I don't know if you guys stop and test this at each step, right? But I'm checking at each step. And what you would have noticed is, like, if as you drag something around, it's both rendering underneath you and you're dragging it. So you'd see like walk the dogs twice here, because it's rendering it in the array or in this list exactly where it was at, and you're seeing the one that I'm dragging. And that's a little bit annoying when you're trying to actually read it and keep track of what you're doing. So all we did here, and this shouldn't be too odd because we were already using this is dragging and is over before in the React drag and drop tutorial. We just didn't use it in this yet. Is we're going to add these properties from this monitor for our drop target and our drag target. So we just hook them up down here. We say, all right, we're going to hook up to the monitor is dragging. We're going to hook up to the monitor is over for the drop target. And we're going to use that logic to, when we're rendering all of our notes, if we're over the note that we're dragging, so for the note that's being dragged, or this is over, although there's a little bit of a, I'm not going to try and solve it, but there's a little bit of a side effect this is over has as well, which I can show. But if it's either of these, then our opacity is 0. So that's just a way to not show your notes, is making it completely transparent. Another way to have done that, other than opacity, so that's why you only see it when you're not exactly over the top. So if I change this to show you, like, reproduce the problem that it had before, so I'll just let the opacity be there all the time, or let it be completely opaque all the time so you'll see it. And then we'll see that, see, I've sort of overwalked the dogs. And so it's hard to read and follow what's going on. The other option is there's a visibility option that you could do instead, where I think it's like hidden and visible. I could have these values wrong, so this may not work off the top of my head, but that's another CSS property that should do the same thing. And the one that I would have here is one that doesn't do the same thing. Is there's a display property where you can set display to none or have it be displayed. And the reason that visibility and opacity work but display doesn't is because visibility and opacity in the DOM itself still draw the still leave the space for the item. So when you're setting the visibility, it still leaves the space under walk the dogs for where the item should be. So it essentially renders it as if it's there and then just doesn't show it. Whereas when you set display none, it collapses that space. So that wouldn't be, you wouldn't have a gap in between like get groceries and try and take over the world anymore, because it would not be rendering that element at all. But that's just some CSS bits. Any questions about any of that section? Yeah. And now we get to, I sort of mentioned this in the last class when we were talking about what actions we would want to do. I was like, maybe we want to be able to drop onto a lane too. There might be a reason to do that. And sure enough, right now we have a problem. If we didn't have that capability to drop onto a lane, there'd be no way to drop something into this lane without something on it. Because right now, or before we did that, you can only sort of drop on another note to rearrange. But once you add in the ability to drop on a lane, you can drop onto these empty lanes. So that's this last bit where we're just doing the exact same stuff we've done before. We're hooking up a drop target. This time for our lane, we're going to use compose to help put stuff together. And it's going to support a note. We can drop a note. We set up this sort of note target bit, which we'll come back and look at in just a moment. And then we just connect up the drop target, node actions, all of our extra stuff that we've done. And you can see here, we just changed our return. So we're wrapped with the drop target. So it's now something we can drop on. And the only special bit of logic that we have is in our note target section. We basically say we only want to actually add this to the lane. We only want to take this action for the target when we're hovering if there's no notes in our lane right now. So that way you're not having both a lane with notes in it processing your note drop and the notes processing it. It's either the lane processing it if it's empty lane, or one of the notes in the lane is processing the drop if otherwise. And so, but that does lead to some side effects, right? Like one that there's things here that may, in usability testing, if somebody's testing this out, they may complain about as a result of this that you need to make more robust and might really increase the complexity of the application. You drag this get groceries over, and you notice if until I'm over that note, even though I'm sort of over this lane, it's not dropping there. And that's because we're only letting a lane handle a drop if it's an empty lane. So somebody may say that's, depending on your usability testing and stuff like that, somebody may say, oh, that's a problem. I feel like that should drop there. So try and fix that. We're not going to do that in here because it gets into a lot more complexity of which one is handling the drop. How do I want to process this? Can more than one thing handle the drop correctly? But that's the type of stuff you would actually be doing if you were building this out as a full product. Another one that I'd mentioned was this problem with the is over invisibility. And that's not as obvious if you just had short, tiny notes like these ones that are one line. But the minute you have this two-line note, you have a problem where you're over that second note for quite a while because it shifted up, but it takes up so much space that you don't get to see that. Well, now I broke something. There we go. You don't get to see that shift right away until you get all the way underneath it. And so somebody may call that like it's some sort of usability problem too. Oh man, why did this other note disappear? Well, because it's more than one line. And even though it shifts up into that position, I would still be over it based off where my current note is. So it's not going to be visible until I get all the way down here and I'm not over it. So maybe you need some different logic around that too. That is over and is dragging might need something a little different to handle it. So let's see where we're at. Any questions on any of that? At that point, I really finished, all the real big functionality at that point, and then they just noticed one glitch that probably none of you would have caught. Unless you're trying to do some usability testing. Again, this is one of those things that would pop up in that testing, was this editing behavior. And that basically what was going on was, let me change the code so we can see it. If I don't pass this in, or I'm just gonna make it false. The problem was that it can be hard to do things like multi-select or other stuff because dragging and editing, well, I don't know. Dragging and editing can conflict with each other. Like if I'm in here and I'm trying to select some text, I can't drag and select that text because it's going to process the try and drag me instead, right? We're used to being able to drag to select text or something like that. So what we did to solve that was we let the note itself know if it's being edited. And then inside of the note, we just did a little bit of a trick. I sort of like it. It's elegant. I actually might. We didn't do this in my old product I worked on, and I may go back and look at it and use this as a way to solve a problem that we encountered in some of that stuff at times. But before we were doing like connect drag source here, this direct connect drag source. All we did now is say we changed it so that if this is a little bit of a conditional expression, it's just very condensed, and it says if this statement is true, then return this value, otherwise return this value. So what it's saying is if we're editing, well, let's look at the case we were already handling before, right? If we're not editing, we're going to return the second value, which is connect drag source. So then this drag source constant is just that connect drag source function. And when we compose, we're connected up as we would expect. But if we are editing, then instead this connect drag source or this drag source function just becomes the identity function. It takes whatever you put into it and gives you back the exact same value. So it does nothing, is essentially what that does. It's a function, but a function that just takes a value and gives it back. So think of a function that takes in 1 and gives you 1. Or a function that takes in hello and gives you hello. It doesn't matter what you put in, you get the same thing back out of it. That's all we're doing there. And that allows you to now drag the select text and everything else, because once you're in that editing state, you're not actually hooking up the drag source anymore. You're hooking up a fake identity function instead of the drag source. But if I'm not editing it, then I can drag it around. So it's a neat little trick, a useful one to sort of learn how to do stuff like that, especially when you're looking at functional type programming. A fun one to have is sort of the last thing that you do in the book. But that's sort of it, at least for the core of this book. Any questions over the core of the book so far? So we finished this. We're done with the core of it. Any questions? No? All right. I'm going to take a minute to talk about some of these additional chapters, some of the extra notes and stuff that they've got here. And then looks like we'll probably be done a little early as well. So I've got some notes, and they don't really dig into them because they're trying to get you actually by the book, right? So I've got this testing React. We haven't talked very much about test-driven development in this class, but you guys did do some sort of test-driven development almost in our last class where we were learning JavaScript, because those assignments that we did on REPL.it followed a pattern that was sort of test-driven. And the idea is what you try and do when you're writing test-driven code is you think about what are the cases that you might have, and you write tests around that. And then you write your function to make sure that it meets those. And that's a little bit of, there's different ways to test. And this talks a lot about this high-level React testing. But we can talk about that at a much lower level. So let's think for a second. Let's just, I'm going to make up, this is actually something that came up this last week at work, and I think it was a great example. It's almost a canonical example of the type of thing you would do like a test-driven development for. So we want to have a function that what it does is converts a name, let's say. And what it takes in is a full name of some kind. And what we want it to return is, and I'll give you some more context around this. What we want it to return is a name of first name and last name or something like that, right? And let's say what it takes in is, in the ideal case, something like something like this, or what would be another? I don't know. But what we want it to return is like Peter Parker or C.S. Lewis instead, right? But we want it to be robust so that it works for a whole bunch of different cases, not just like a perfect case or not something like this. So let's take a moment and let's do something. We don't have to actually write this out, but what's the expected output for this? Right? That's sort of what we expect, right? About this one. Right, these are easy. Now, what are some things that you could do that might trip this up? If we're think of some, if we pass something in, what might be a tricky version of something like this? Maybe if we added a middle name, that's a good one. How would we handle that? I don't know. So, you know, that may be written out. You know, if you did Lewis, you know, for example, you might do, not sure if that's his middle name, it's close to it. But you might do something like that, right? And then you would say, like, what do I expect the output of this to be? Given that input, you know? I want to see if I've got the name right. Close. Staples. Ah, it was right. It's the plural. And you'd say, oh, this is what I expect. Any other, I mean, think about what someone could give you that might be wrong or messed up. Think about names and all of the different variants that. What if you have two last names? Like what, yeah, what if you have like, or a hyphenated last name or something like that, right? Right, and then you're like, well, what do I expect, right? I expect you might say, what if I don't have a last name? Like, what's my expected output? What do I expect to get here? What? You expect to get that back? Missed the N. There we go. What if, I mean, let's think of other cases. What if we have something that's just wrong? Like we have, like, what do we expect their output from that? I mean, yeah, we get to make our choice, right? This is us deciding what we want the output to be. What if instead we have, you know, the opposite? There's something went wrong and we only have like, what do we expect the output of that to be? Like, oops, we're missing a first name in the original version or something, right? Like, but there's a comma still. I don't know. Like we may say like, well, we need to figure that out. It's let's try and make a decision, right? So the idea of test-driven development, which is a very common pattern when you're building stuff like this, and this is literally a problem that we encountered at work this week, is our backend is giving us names, comma separated, like this way, but we want to display them in a first name, last name syntax, and we had a very, very simple function to do that, but it wasn't catching all the cases. So we sort of sat down and we said, oh, what about some of these other cases? What happens, right? How are we going to handle that? And what you would do in test-driven development is you end up writing a whole bunch of tests where you invoke your function and check to make sure that your output is what you expected it to be. So you can imagine if we have this function, and let's just act like it's there, and you know we've written this thing out. I'm going to change this up a little bit. So even though this stuff isn't valid up there, you know, this will sort of be valid here. You know, and right now I'll just be lazy. I'll say it returns full name. So it's sort of a valid little bit. And then what you might have are a whole bunch of little tests down here. that could say, and I'm going to do this without a framework to help us, but really you use a framework that makes this just a tiny bit easier almost all the time instead of writing this out. So you could say, if convert name, so pass in Lewis c.s. So we're going to call it, if the result of that does not equal right, and you could write a whole bunch of these, right? All right, test this out. If this doesn't equal this, then you failed. If this hasn't equaled this, then you failed. And what you would do is, now I can write out the, you would need these to have more meaning, right? So you would have, instead, you wouldn't just say failed this test, because how am I going to find the one that failed in reality? Which is why you use a tool to help you out a little bit. But now what you can do, if you've written out a whole bunch of these, is now you can start writing the function, this convert name function. And as you write it, you can run your tests to see if you've met all the cases that you thought about originally. So it's a way to now check your function and say, is this doing what I actually want it to do? Is it covering all of the cases that we thought we need to cover? And so that's known as the test-driven development cycle, where what you do is you write some tests, you write your code to pass your tests, you write more tests, you write the code to pass the tests, and you go sort of back and forth, testing and writing the code to get the test to pass. And that's a more modern development cycle, but it's really, really useful when you're working on bits of code, small self-contained pieces of code, because it gets you thinking, like, what do I actually need to cover for this? What are my cases? What are the failure cases? What's the weird states I could get into? And what do I expect when that happens?
Well, how would you actually write that?
If you were like, if I was to do this is how I would probably do this if I'm going to write it out manually, right? I'm going to actually use like a test framework, and so I would use something like which is a JavaScript test tool. And so this helps you out with testing. So what you end up doing is you write something called like a describe, which is essentially setting up this test suite. That might be really hard to read. I don't think I can change their color. Let me see if I can find a different tutorial on this or something. This might be better, really, even. No, it doesn't really explain it. Just looking for something that's not need it with a different font. Okay, so what you would write out in code would be something more like this, where you'd be testing, like, it is sort of your test you're writing inside of this block, and you're going to say, what am I testing? And then inside of that, you're going to have your test. And what you'll do is say, I expect this. So in our case, it would be like expect convert name of, this C.S. Lewis bit or whatever to equal the other string. And if you were writing that out yourself and you didn't have a little test framework around to help you out, the way you would probably do something like what we have up above is something like this. You would probably, and this is just me being very lazy. You'd want more structure around it than this, but I'm going to be super, super lazy, right? Names to test equals, and I'm going to make this an array, and then each side of each one of these, I'm going to have another array. So this is an array of arrays, right? But each internal array is just 2 items. it's just the first one and the input and the output. And then I'm going to stop it here because we didn't decide what we wanted the behavior to be for this last one. Right? We were like, oh, we're not sure. And so then if I was writing this out as my own test somewhere, I don't know why this is telling me, oh, that's wrong. There we go. Then what you would do is like iterate over those items. So you could do like a names to test dot for each name, and that's going to give you each one of these. Hold on, I need the function. So the function would be the name is going to get passed into my function. And then for each one of the names, I have my first part and my second part. So I'm actually going to break that down where input, I'm going to use array destructuring and get my input name and my output name off of my name. And then I would say if convert name with input name does not equal my output name, then console.error, probably because an error happened in my test. I'm going to use this lazy string interpolation. Failed expected convert name of input name to be output name. Got some syntax wrong. Unterminated template. Oh, right here. So if I were to run this, and I should, depends on what version of Node is on this system. I might be able to run this file directly. Let me see. Oh, this file isn't saved anywhere. Let me save this file. I'm just going to save it right here. I'm going to call it I don't have any JSX in there, so I'm just going to call it JS. So let's see if this works. Oh, it's in my app folder, right? That's right there. All right. You can see it's outputting like my failures. I expected each one of these to work. And now that you've got your failures for an approach like this, now we could start writing this function, right? Like, oh, we're given a full name as our input. How am I going to handle this? And I'm going to do a very, very naive implementation first. It's going to fail in some of these cases probably, but we'll do it. We'll say const, very similar to what we were sort of doing before. I'm going to destructure, but I know I've got my full name here first, and I want to split this on a comma. And then I'm going to take each item that comes out of that and map it into a function that takes the name or the word, but I'll just say name that we got, and returns name.trim, which is trimming off any white space on it. So we're getting rid of any white space that are part of it. And then I'm just going to return, we'll do this again. This is some very dense code, but first name, last name. I'll talk about it in a minute. Let's see if we pass some of them. Cool, it looks like we only had 2 failures now. So that with that little bit of code, we were able to pass like 3 of our cases, or 4 of our cases, I think. Which is awesome. And we have 1 failure now that we weren't having before. This Prince failure that we didn't have before. Now, does this little bit of code sort of make sense? Like I said, it's very dense, but what we do is we take this full name, which was the input, we split it on commas, and what that'll do is give us back an array for each item that's split off of a comma. So the first item in that array will be Lewis, and the second one will be space c.s. And then I'm running it through mat for each item in that array, taking that individual thing in, so Lewis and then the space c.s. and I'm trimming any white space off. So I get back an array now of Lewis and then c.s. without the white space. And then I'm destructuring that, knowing that the first item in that array is going to be the last name, or it's almost always the last name, and the second one is the first name. So I can be a little lazy here and do all that in one line, and then I'm just flipping them around and converting them, putting a space in there and returning it in a different format. But if we wanted to also handle these other cases, like Prince, all we had was 1 name, and this comma space John, then we're going to have to do some extra work to figure out what happened. And it actually might be nicer here. Like I would change this output. I don't like this anymore. I want to change it so that what I do is I want to see what it gave me instead. So instead of me outputting like what my original one was, I want to say what did I get back when I ran it? And now if I ran that, it gives me much more useful information. Expected undefined Prince to be Prince. So that's actually what it gave me back, was undefined space Prince. Expected John space to be John without a space. Okay, so it's adding an extra space here. Oh yeah, because I don't have a last name and it adds a space. Of course it does. Well, maybe one way to fix that is to just trim this too, because then if I don't have a last name, it'll strip off that space at the end. And cool, now we're down to just undefined and Prince is our error case, and then we would need to handle that. And that's possible for us to handle as well. In different ways. Like in this case, what we can say is it's getting undefined because there's no last name, right? Or there's no first name that it's pulling off. There's no second item. And so when there's nothing there, it's undefined. When you try to access something in an array that's not there, right? Well, here I can do I can say a default, give this a default value of nothing if, or an empty string if it's not an actual value. We're passing all of our tests that we wrote. So what we did was we defined what we expected the input and the output to be, and then we were able to write a function around that to help us. It helped us a lot in terms of knowing what we actually needed to do and covering the different cases. And that's a really good way to think about it, because it separates out the what am I expecting to put into it and get out from the implementation part. So one of these other sections that was in this book is it talks about testing React. It goes into it's much harder when you're talking at like, how am I testing a whole React component? Look at all these complex bits that are going on, right? Like I'm showing you a simple solution, a simple test-driven development cycle here, but we jump over to React, like you're trying to do something. There's a lot of tools to help you do some of that, but it's still a very useful feature for a lot of different reasons. So it also mentions typing with React. I don't think this is particularly important, but React does have this concept of, it's not built into it, but a separate library that's very, very popular is known as prop types. And what prop types let you do is it lets you define, give some constraints around the properties that you can set. So like if we went to our application and we looked at our note, and our note takes in a editing property, for example, this editing property is a Boolean. That's what we expect. It's a Boolean, and it needs to be true or false. So it's required, and we want it to be a Boolean. So if you're looking at adding prop types, and this is only useful for debugging and development because this gets stripped out when you do a production level build, we could say, add in some prop type settings and say, we expect this guy to be a Boolean, the editing, and there's the ability to say, where is it? To say this is required. So what you would do is say, if we were trying to do something like that, and go back up to this top here, you would have note.prop types, editing is prop types.boolean.required. It's a Boolean value, it's required, it has to be on there. And then you'll get some warnings or errors in your developer tools if they're not what you expect. So it's just a way to check stuff to make your coding easier. And then what else do we have? Styling. I'm not even going to begin to get into styling. There's way too many ways to do this. But if you're interested in playing around with your app and trying out some other styling, I would say one of the easiest ways to bring in more styling and try something out would be look at React Bootstrap. It's one of the most popular styling frameworks out there outside of React. And so if you use it in React, it'll work just slightly differently, but you'll have the largest community of things to pull answers off of in terms of how to make stuff work. So if you want to play with your Notes app more and give it some really cool styling, look at React Bootstrap, consider pulling it in and adding some cool styling to your project using that. And then the structuring React projects, this makes more sense after you've built more projects in this. I feel like this isn't something worth covering until you've built a good number of real world things, because then you'll get a feel for why it makes sense to structure stuff in different ways. All right, are there any questions at all at this point? No? So I'm gonna give you guys one last challenge. What I'd like to see, I mentioned it last time again, is I'd like for people, if possible, to go check out this. And I'll double check to make sure if I had to change any settings. I think most of it was mentioned here, what you needed to change. You need to do something with your webpack.config. I'll try and double check what those are, but if you've been deploying your code to GitHub, if you have a GitHub repository where your code goes, try and run this npm run deploy, follow the instructions here to set it up. And if you succeed at that, you can get it up and you're able to access your site from GitHub. Post the link in the Slack channel so that we can all click on it just like you could with Cruises. Wow, names. Just like you go with the one that Cruise provided. And that way we'll get to see your end product for your drag and drop application. All right. Awesome. I got nothing else.